Flood Community Forum, but firstly I was wanting to do the acknowledgement to country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we gather, the Jagera and the Turrbal people. We acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to call firstly upon Elizabeth, who has worked tirelessly in the organisation this afternoon, and she'll give you a broad overview and introduction. Elizabeth.
Yeah, thanks, Gerard. Welcome to today's afternoon Breaking the Cycle Flood Community Forum. So this is put on together with myself, an ocean and water engineer, and historian Neville. And so the host is the Southern Brisbane Suburban Forum. And basically we're a community organisation encouraging advocacy to inform, educate and engage on very public interest topics. And we've got the aim to create a democratic voice for the residents and businesses in the Brisbane Southern Forum of Brisbane, and we also inviting decision makers into the conversation. And we welcome Peter Rosso for being in the audience. Thank you very much. So I'll hand back to Gerard to give an introduction to our panel.
Thanks. Just a few housekeeping matters. Firstly, the toilets per se are up to the right, fire exits are there and over there, and there's a disabled toilet which is further out down the back and round to the left. In accordance with those acknowledgements as well, we thank you, Mr. Russell, for making the time to be here this afternoon. We also need to acknowledge Councillor Shree was unable to attend, and also Councillor Nicole Johnson, who played a material role in ensuring that this event could occur this afternoon, but was unable to attend and sends her apologies. We have three speakers this afternoon with respect to the issues in question, and then we'll have some open questions from the audience. The first speaker for this afternoon is Dr Margaret Cook. Dr Cook is a history lecturer at the University of Sunshine Coast and holds the Honorary Research Fellow positions at La Trobe University and the University of Queensland. She's been a freelance historian for many years, working in the heritage, museum, government and private sectors, and publishing on numerous topics. She holds a PhD in history at the University of Queensland, and her current research interests include natural disasters, water politics and environmental history. There's been a wealth of current material being worked on in the future connected. Her recent books are A River with a City Problem, A History of River floods, and an edited collection with Scott McKinnon, Disasters in Australia and New Zealand, Historical Approaches to Understanding Catastrophe. She was the recipient of the John and Ruth Kerr Medal of Distinction for Excellence in Historiography, Historical Research and Writing in 2020. I'd like you all to welcome Dr.
Thank you, everyone. It's a delight to see so many people here today on an appropriately wet day. The Bureau of Meteorology, as you know, has announced a third La Nina year. So we now have 3 in a row, which means we have a much greater chance of floods. We have soaked catchments, full creeks and rivers. The dam is relatively full, in fact they're releasing. And we have a very, very high runoff rate. For perspective, it will only be the 4th time since records were kept since 1900 that we're actually having a triple La Nina year, and they're actually suggesting we might go into the 4th. The other 3 were 1954 to 57, 73 to 76, and 1998 to 2001. As I said, Suncorp Insurance is particularly worried about the potential 4th one. Now, this doesn't mean major flooding. In fact, the 1998 ones didn't create enormous flooding. But it doesn't always mean that it will be a massive flooding, but the 1974 floods in particular were amongst the worst that we've ever had. So today what I want to talk to you about is what do the lessons from history actually teach us. So that's the question I'll pose. What can we learn from the past that will help us today and in the future? So I'm going to give you a brief history of floods in Brisbane to get some context, and then I'm going to talk about ways that we can actually minimise the impact on ourselves. So first, the history. So to give you an idea, there's our bearings. That's the Brisbane River catchment. And often the water, as it is now, is pouring into the headwaters, and it will feed its way down the Brisbane River system. Now, Aboriginal stories of deep time tell us about really much bigger floods than we actually remember, and the geological record also shows very extensive flooding. Explorers also noticed evidence of floods. When they came through in 1824, it wasn't long after we'd actually had floods, and they noticed debris really high in the trees and deep scouring in the riverbeds, which showed evidence of really big floods. In 1841, the year before Queensland became a free settlement, they actually had a really large flood. It's probably reached about 8.42 metres in Brisbane, but we really don't know because of lack of records at the time. But the thing is that it went unheeded. It wasn't even really written up in the paper at the time. So despite Aboriginal knowledge and experience from the explorers and the early experiences of the settlers, the British went ahead and built a city on the floodplain of a flood-prone river. So we end up with this situation. This is a slide from 1888, and as you can see that the city is really hugging the river. And the population around then, around up to about 1890, was about 100,000 people. Now when the British settlers first started building Brisbane, there were some floods. The 1860s was a particularly wet decade. But it was a flood of 1890 that really made people start to think about floods. And that flood reached a height of about 5.3 metres. But as it turned out, that was really just a dress rehearsal. The 1892 to 1893 summer was really hot throughout most of Queensland. It had been in a drought. But that drought broke in 1893. And in February alone, the Brisbane River gauge recorded 1,000 millimetres in February, in that month alone. So here's the rainfall maps from that era, and you can see in that top one, the purple area, it's up in the headwaters. So that's up in the upper catchment. And that flood reached 8.35 metres. But then there was another little flood a week later, and then a fortnight later from this one, there was a third flood. And it's 8.09 metres. And as you can see, it's throughout the entire river catchment. Now I'll show you these two slides to point out two really important things to note straight away. There wasn't 100 years between them. There was a fortnight. And they're very, very different floods. That one's throughout the entire catchment. That's like the 2022 flood. So as a result of those floods, Brisbane was severely flooded, of that rain, severely flooded. You can see here the flood heights to get you some idea already of the relativity of the floods that we've experienced. So Brisbane was reduced to canals, pretty much. One thing I was told when I started researching is people take photos when the floods are going down. So assume that they're always higher than these. The Victoria Bridge actually washed away, and the north side and the south side were isolated from each other for 3 years, only accessible by ferry. And the suburbs were equally affected. For example, in two South Brisbane wards, 198 buildings were destroyed and a further 67 were damaged. On the Eagle Farm Flats, an estimated 500 houses just washed away. Now, the damage bill was between about £1 and £2 million, and it's really significant because in the 1890s, Brisbane was experiencing an economic depression, so it was a compounding problem. So what they decided to do was to look at engineering solutions. And they looked at a whole lot of things, and they did widen the river, they truncated some bends, they deepened the river. But ultimately what they decided to do was to build a dam. They decided to build Somerset Dam. And it began in the 1930s, was delayed by World War II, and was finally opened in 1959. And it's a dual-purpose dam. It was the first in the Southern Hemisphere to be a dual-purpose dam. So it does water supply and flood mitigation. And there's another problem that we need to think about as well, because you've got that inbuilt tension of how to manage a dam that's trying to do two things. And here's Somerset Dam. Now, in having built a dam, people in Brisbane decided that floods had been tamed, that there wouldn't be any more floods. And the Coordinator General at the time actually warned against this fallacy, and he described it as the Somerset Syndrome. And he said, don't build on the floodplains. Dams cannot prevent floods. They have a finite capacity, and their ability to capture water depends entirely where it falls. If it falls upstream, as it did in that first rainfall map I showed you, that's called a favourable flood. Somerset Dam can withhold it. If it falls downstream, it's unfavourable. And there's not a lot we can do. On Australia Day weekend in 1974, heavy rain fell throughout the entire Brisbane River catchment. So you can see it's downstream of Somerset Dam. In 26 days in January, Brisbane received 872 millimetres, second only to the 1893 record of 1,000 millimetres. Somerset Dam, therefore, was only able to hold back the Stanley River water, with no ability to control the water downstream. Now, it did reduce the flood height in Brisbane by 1 metre. And so here you've got some relative heights there. So you can see it's a 5.45 metre flood at the Port Office gauge. 14 people died in this flood in Brisbane and 2 in Ipswich. And this gives you an idea again of the impact in Brisbane. It's the same areas that are flooded again. This time the bridges didn't wash away though. So you can see the familiar sites of Rockley and Yeronga flooding in 74. There's always a winner in floods. I think it's these guys stealing the beer from the brewery. So the solution was the same as the last time. They'd build another dam. Now they'd already started planning Wivenhoe Dam and started getting the land ready in the 1960s, but they fast-tracked it as a result of the 74 flood. But this really, really fostered the myth that we'd have no more dams. I call this the Wivenhoe myth. So they built Wivenhoe Dam. And it's 3 times the size of Somerset Dam. So it does reduce flood heights. Brisbane didn't have any flood control planning measures at all until the 1970s. And then it adopted this idea that we've got of the 1 in 100 control to control development. And the idea is that we would minimise development to a certain level, but it's a compromise. And this 1 in 100 is another term that gets bandied around a lot, and it doesn't mean we've got a 100-year gap between them. It means there's a 1% chance in any year of a flood of that height or greater. But it's been shorthand to 1 in 100 years, which becomes this idea that we've got a 100-year gap. And that's actually one of the most dangerous things out there in terms of making people complacent about floods. And if nothing else, the 2 and a fortnight in 1893 should show that. So it was assumed and modelled into our planning structure that Wivenhoe Dam would reduce floods by 3 metres. But as I said, that depends where the rain falls. And Wivenhoe and Somerset Dam actually only control half the catchment. So if it's downstream of the dam, there's nothing we can do. So let's go forward to 2010. I told you this is a speed rush through the history of flooding in Brisbane. This is a speed, we're up to 2010. So we had just done the Millennium Drought. I'm sure we all remember the Millennium Drought when we all had to have our short showers and couldn't use taps and sprinklers and all the rest of it. And that was 2001 to 2009, and that's the worst drought on record so far. Focus was on saving water. And then in December 2010 it rained. It rained a lot, so they had to start releasing water from Wivenhoe Dam in December, and then actually managed that really well to get the dam back to the point where it could absorb the floods again. But in January 2011, the equivalent of a 1974 flood flowed into Wivenhoe Dam that was already had its water supply compartment full. And so it didn't have any extra capacity to hold the water. So they started releasing the water as rapidly as they were allowed to in accordance with the manual. But the manual lets them have 7 days to empty the flood storage compartment because otherwise it causes too much damage downstream. So with their 7-day margin, they started this process, but 36 hours later, they got the equivalent of another 1974 flood into the dam. There's your rainfall throughout the entire catchment. So soon after the first flood, waters the same size as the 74 flood were pouring into Wivenhoe Dam. We actually really don't know how much water we got because it was right over the Wivenhoe Dam and some of the gauges washed away. but the rainfall was so intense, it was more intense than was forecast. So the water came within half a metre of the fuse plug in Ivanhoe Dam, and that's actually a fuse plug that will automatically open up the gates. And it's designed to protect the dam, because the ultimate strategy in dam management is to protect the dam. If we lose that dam, we lose our water supply. It'll take a long time to build that dam again, and then it's Armageddon if the dam just fails. So you have to protect the dam. So they had to release it at a greater rate than they had planned, and that caused massive inundation downstream. That's actually in December, that release. And there's your comparative flood heights again. So you can see how high it was compared to the others. It was actually a relatively small flood. And in case you're curious, Ivanhoe reduced it by 2 metres. But Brisbane flooded again. You can see here these images. Some, again, familiar sights to you all. The floods caused 21 deaths in the Lockie Valley and 1 in Brisbane. In Brisbane, about 14,000 properties were affected across 94 suburbs. Around 1,200 houses and 557 businesses were inundated, and a further nearly 2,000 were partially inundated. And some more photos. That's a very typical sight that we see all too often in Brisbane, of the rubbish that has to be taken away. So that takes us to 2022 and our February floods. We experienced extreme rain again. As I said, it's a La Nina year when floods are more likely, but the rainfall was much higher than was forecast again. Some places in Brisbane received over a metre of rain in 5 days. But this time the dam was lower. It was already only 56% in terms of the water storage compartment, so it was able to fill that part beforehand. And that was very fortunate, because you could manage the dam differently. But much of the rain fell downstream of the dam. As you know, again, creek systems, and particularly North Brisbane got flooded. It doesn't always get flooded. And it created, because everything was so wet, it created this enormous runoff effect. And so we had overland flow and overland flooding, and we had creek flooding and riverine flooding. And as I said, some of it was in areas that hadn't flooded in 2011. The advantage was that the dam had more capacity. And so it was able to hold about 2.2 million megalitres. And once the dam reached 170%, which includes the flood compartment, water had to be released. And at one stage, the dam reached 187%. The 2022 flood peaked at the flood height of 3.85 metres at the city gauge. And the rainfall had significant effect, partially because of its overland flow this time. And here you can see, again, these areas that flooded in 2022. So, what I would say to you is that unfortunately we've built in a subtropical region on a subtropical river. And as we continue to build and live in Brisbane, we have to accept the inevitability of flooding, and we have to plan accordingly. We need to support and encourage any council or state initiatives to address this problem, like buyback schemes or refusal of development applications in flood-prone areas. And we need to think really hard about new planning schemes that actually create no-go zones to reduce the hazard. Okay, but what else can we do? What do the lessons of history actually teach us? And what can we do to get ready? My 5 top tips. So the first one is no 2 floods are the same. So whilst we have the advantage of historical and lived experience, which is a great help, sometimes it can actually be a liability. If you've been flooded before, you will be more aware of the risk. You might be more aware of where the water might come to and what you might need to do. But research has also shown that sometimes this can be a problem. For example, in 1893, shop owners in Brisbane moved all their belongings to the height of the 1890 flood, only to discover that the floodwaters kept rising and they had to keep moving their stuff higher and higher and higher. When the developers subdivided the Centenary Estates in Jindalee, they asked around and discovered about the 1931 flood. And so they decided that that was the height that they would build the Centenary suburbs to. They didn't do enough historical research to find out that, in fact, the 1931 flood was small. It didn't even feature in my talk today. So they needed to think about the 1974 flood, or even better, the 1893 flood. Now, the knowledge can work the other way too. Some places were flooded in 2022 that hadn't flooded in 2011, although the 2011 floods were bigger. But I know I would prefer to erring on the side of the potential biggest flood and get out. And the reason no two floods are the same are largely human-induced, as well as the fact of where the rain falls. It depends on what we've done in the meantime. Every single impermeable surface we build, every driveway, every rooftop, changes where the water can go. If we build a shopping centre car park, the water needs to go somewhere else. And we change the flood profile. So no two floods will ever be exactly the same, not even necessarily in your own backyard. Floods depend on where and when and how much rain falls at any one time. If we get 100 millimetres over a week, it's not a problem at all. But if we get it in half an hour, it starts to be a problem. And if the rain falls downstream of the dams, it's a big problem. It's a very different outcome. Floods can be caused by overflowing creeks or rivers or overland flow, or any of the above. They can be extremely localised or widespread, as I've shown you, and these factors make it really difficult to forecast them and impossible to predict. But many of us in the room have now lived through the 2022 floods and have recent knowledge. Studies show that as floods recede in our memory, so does our understanding and our desire to manage floods. As the keepers of that knowledge, it's up to each and every one of us to share that information with newcomers to the region who may not be as aware of the risk as we are. So share what you wish you'd been told when you move to the region. Tip 2. Share information and educate the public. As individuals, we need to work out who are the reliable sources of information and trust them. There are stories in the 1974 floods of members of the State Emergency Service tapping on doors and telling people to get out, but people ignored them. And the same thing happened in 2011 and 2022, where people had to call the police to make people move. It's a waste of people's resources. It's really a good idea to get out. It's very important for City Council and other government agencies to disseminate timely and accurate information in an understandable format. For example, for someone like me, that if you tell me that a flood's going to reach 5 metres at the Port Office gauge, it actually doesn't help me a lot. And it really didn't help me at all until I actually knew where the Port Office gauge was. It's really, really hard to comprehend a flood height and translate it to your local area. 5 metres in Brisbane in the city doesn't help a lot. Rivers are actually on a slope, so that could mean 19 metres in Ipswich. So it might be much more help to tell somebody that the Corso's gone under or Muriel Avenue is underwater. It's going to help you make plans to evacuate. Tip 3, have a plan. In schools, our children do fire plans. I think my sons did about 10, where we knew how to get down low and go. But we never did a flood plan, and I'm far more likely to flood. Do we actually all know where our valuable possessions are? Where are our important records in our house? I actually have a drawer in my house where I have all those things, birth certificates, insurance policies, all those things. Or put them on your phone or somewhere else where you can get them to, because those are going to make your life a lot easier after the floods. Many of us have a computer. Try and put that information on that and take it with you. But I admit to, like anybody else in the room, there's probably a lot more I can do. We actually spent yesterday building a drain in our house. And many of us have an idea of something we can do. One thing I did do was go and buy my battery-operated radio yesterday. So I should put that there to talk about in a minute. But have you thought about things you could do and what you would need to collect in a hurry? How would you actually move your possessions? In the 1970s, I found a lot more people were connected with their community. They were often a member of a church group or a sports group or a community group of some sort. And they were able to call on their friends, many of them owned a ute, who would help them move their stuff. And that was a big factor in the 74 floods, far more than 2011. I think there's an idea that maybe people were more connected. Brisbane was a lot smaller, and I think that actually helped. Whereas in 2011, people had to rely on strangers, the Mud Army, after the event. So that's something we need to think about. We need to think about maybe making some more community connections so that we can help each other. Maybe we could start thinking about who we can help or who could help us. We all should find a friend who lives on a hill. We know from history and flood modelling where the flooded areas are likely to be. And if you don't, I really think you spend some time on the Brisbane City Council website trying to find that out before the power goes down in the flood. Think about your own flood risk, think about who you can help, and let's help our most vulnerable. Where will you actually take your possessions? There are clubs and schools that have sheds. Yet is it possible for some of these community organisations and say the City Council to actually get that mobilised in advance? Because often it's too late. The water's rising, the roads are clogged with people, as much as water, trying to get their stuff out. It'd be really useful in a time like today when we know that the floods are hovering for briefs to go out telling us where those sheds actually are so we can start thinking about it. My uncle lived in Yeronga in the 1974 floods, and he moved his stuff to the Yeronga Church Hall where he's a member, and he wrote his name on the back of the furniture. And it worked, because he's still got that furniture and it's still got his name on it. We also know from 2011 and 2022 that IKEA furniture isn't very good in floods. Chipboard is no match for hardwood, and then our dumps struggle to keep up. So what's your evacuation plan? Roads get clogged with traffic, and roads that are flooded become really bad evacuation routes. And roads are actually built to a much lower flood frequency, so the roads fill up faster. So think about where your vulnerable roads are and try and avoid them. If it's flooded, forget it, as they say. Being isolated isn't much fun either. It's worse to be flooded, but being isolated isn't good. So if you can afford it, maybe get a little bit of extra food in advance if heavy rains are forecast. Now, there are two statistics whenever I talk about floods that just deeply shock me. One is that we spend 97% of our money on recovery and 3% on being proactive. I really think we need to change that dynamic. Just imagine if we even shifted it to 60-40. The other stat that shocks me is that for every $1 we spend, we save $7 in recovery. So the money I spent yesterday on my drains might actually make my life a lot better in a few weeks. So keep that in mind for all that time we're spending packing up or cleaning your drains. Future you might actually really thank you. Tip 4, listen to the flood warnings and act appropriately. History shows that people drown in floods because they take risks. They drive through floodwaters. They go back home to get their spectacles, as was the case of a public servant in 1974 in St Lucia. They swim in the floodwaters. Apart from the velocity of the water that will sweep you away, you don't want to be swimming in those waters. If you're lucky, you'll come across snakes and bull sharks. But you could also come across sewage and chemicals and things that will make you very sick, and missiles. A jetty or a boat or a pontoon coming down that river will flatten you and your car. If the 1893 floodwaters can take out a bridge, you're not going to be able to compete with that. In 1917, the Centenary Bridge at Dingley was wrecked by a barge. It was shut, half one lane was shut for 18 months. And we know the walkway washed away in 2011. So the velocity of that water is incredible. So if it's flooded, truly forget it. Sewage and chemicals in the water is a very large problem. A top tip is to put a sandbag in your toilet. It's the best thing you can do with that sandbag because it will stop the sewage entering your house. The risk of infection after floods is very, very high. Tetanus, staph infection, to say some of them. 2 people died after the 2019 Townsville floods from infection. The sewage treatment and water supply plants are a great risk in floods, and the water supply can be compromised, so having some water on hand is not a bad idea either. This is the practical tip I've already mentioned, the battery-operated radio, so that you can listen to the warnings. Now, this happens in history. In 1893, the telegraph lines fell down and the telegraph failed. In 1974, the telephone failed. In 2011, the internet went down. What survived was the radio, especially the ABC, although moving it to the south bank beside the river wasn't the best idea because it was a problem for them in 2022. However, the electricity fails and your phones go flat and you can't watch the TV. So get yourself a battery-operated radio and a battery-operated torch. And finally, because my time must be coming up, please take some individual responsibility. Pack up what you can and get out as soon as you can. Take your medicines and your pharmaceutical scripts, or your baby formula and nappy. The SES after 2011 spent a lot of time ferrying nappies, baby formula and medication around to people who could have packed some of it up at least. Pack an overnight bag if you can, and best to put it in a backpack, because then you have your hands free if you need to climb into a boat. As I said, the SES spent time rescuing people when some of those people really could have got out. And that means they can't go elsewhere where they're really needed. And in fact, in 2022, an SES worker died. In the months leading up to January and February, when the floods are more likely, although it's looking a little earlier than that if possible, maybe think about the drainage around your home. Start moving things to higher ground, buy your radio and develop a plan. One of the things that stresses humans the most is feeling that we have no sense of control. Research shows that it's actually the uncertainty of floods that causes the most trauma, both before and during and after the event. So what I'm suggesting to you with these 5 top tips is some way of achieving some sense of control. You can't stop the rain, you can't stop the floods, but by having a plan, your essential medicine, a radio and your critical documentation safe, it will offer you some comfort. It might make life a little easier if you are flooded, and at least you will know that you are as ready as you could possibly be. So thanks for letting me talk to you today.
Right, it's incredible how stupid where we live on Foxley Creek. There was a couple of young kids at the back that were riding jet skis up and down the creek at the height of the flood. It was just simply amazing. So our next speaker is Andrew Thompson. Andrew is a floodplain engineer and writer. His extensive experience in the water resources industry across Australia has worked predominantly on projects ranging from small-scale hydraulic models to large catchment analysis for future developments. His core technical skills lie in numeric hydrology and hydraulic modelling and community consultation. Most recently, he was on ABC Radio Brisbane Mornings program with Rebecca Livingston taking Southern Brisbane Suburban Forum Floods and Flooding. I'd like to ask you to welcome Andrew.
Thanks very much. Great to see a lot of people here today. I'm a gigantic flood nerd, so it's good to see some people out there with an interest, and it certainly doesn't escape me that 6 hours ago I was sweeping water out of my laundry because I've got a drainage problem. Might be to see you, Margaret, bring Charlotte this afternoon. My role today, I'm a technical person. My background, as said before, is catchment management, hydrology, hydraulics, and floodplain management. Calling myself a senior floodplain engineer is a bit of a catch-all title. I wear many hats, but the one thing in common is that I deal in flooding. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you today about is certainly the technical aspects of flood models, because flood modelling is a critical tool in understanding flood behaviour and also planning for the future. So we'll just start from the basics, and I just want to apologise. Honestly, this is a topic I can talk for about 2 hours on. I've got 10 to 15 minutes, so if I'm racing through the slides, feel free to come up to me afterwards and have a chat to me about it. I will chew your ear off. So what is flood modelling? Essentially, it's hydrology and hydraulics. Hydrology is calculating and estimating the amount of water that falls from the sky. Hydraulics is working out where it goes when it hits the ground. A flood model is a tool. It's a tool that sits in the background of a lot of other aspects of our day-to-day life. It informs planning schemes. It informs, emergency management. It informs future decisions and also our day-to-day lives. It's a complex computational process that simulates rainfall and flood events. We look at design storms, which is something that Margaret touched on earlier when we talked about our 1 in 100 or our AEP, which is also called an annual exceedance probability. So we look at design storms, we look at historic storms, we study storms in flood models such as the 1893, the 1974, 2011 flood event. We also look at future storms and future floods, with the effects of climate change. This is only going to get worse, it's only going to happen more frequently. So why do we need a flood model? Essentially, one of the main tips is flood forecasting. We need to work out where these floods are going to occur and how severe they're going to be. We use it for water resource management, as Margaret pointed out. There is no, there's no dam development unless you've got a hydrology model. There's no point in building a dam unless you know where the water's going to go. We've got planning scheme mapping. Every council has a planning scheme. Every council has a flood overlay code. That's critical in working out where development moves forward. As Margaret said, it's only been 50 years or so that we've actually adopted some sort of relevant and good flood planning policies here in Brisbane. Before that, it was a bit of a free-for-all, and I think we all know where all those properties are. We're also looking at emergency management, which is a critical aspect of using a flood model to work out how long a person has to evacuate, how long a road going to someone's house will be inundated for. And also for civil design. We use flood models to inform design of culverts, of roads, of critical infrastructure such as railways and highways. So how do you develop a flood model? And again, I'm not going to get too technical here because I will go on all day about this stuff. But essentially the number one thing we need is a rainfall analysis. That there's an IFD chart, it's called an intensity, frequency, duration chart. That plots rainfall, and we get all that from the Bureau of Meteorology and also from records. There's loss models as well. We take into account infiltration, evaporation. In order to build a hydraulic model, a flood model, we need topography. So we have LiDAR, which is aerial laser survey. And there's been a lot of advancement in this technology that, 20 years ago, all we had was contour mapping, maybe some survey and some really coarse data. Now, every couple of years, data is flown in Brisbane. So there's about 5 or 6 sets of rainfall, of topographic data you can currently get in Brisbane. There's a topographic model, the red being the higher area, the blue being the lower areas of the ocean outfall. We also need detailed ground survey. That also helps. And earthwork models. If we're going to build a road or a bridge, then we need to actually put that in our model as well. We also need to replicate what is on the ground that we want to replicate. We want to simulate, I should say. This here is a roughness map. So a flood model actually interpolates and infers what's on the ground. So we have a GIS tool that basically simulates the ground cover, buildings, roads, different types of vegetation and water bodies. It's also known as managed roughness, by the way. So we can represent urban areas, we can represent rural areas. We can also investigate future land use changes, which I think is one of the most important. So what happens if you get rid of all those urban areas? What happens if you get rid of all the vegetated areas? That can actually infer the model. We also need to put in our culverts, our crossings, our structures. That's a culvert in real life on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side what it looks like in the model. So we're looking at bridges, detention basins, weirs and dams. All these structures are critical in developing a flood model because they all change flood behaviour. We also look at calibration. A model is not useful unless it's been validated or calibrated. It is a theoretical model. So we look at stream gauges, surveyed flood marks, photography, anecdotal information. And what we've got here is on the left-hand side is an aerial photograph of a flood event, and on the right-hand side is the model simulating that flood event. Now the model can be tweaked and adjusted to represent the ground conditions as well. Now Margaret touched on this before, and I think it's quite critical that we understand the types of floods, because in this day and age of social media there's a lot of misinformation. The main types of floods in this part of the world There's three kinds. The first one we'll touch on is overland flow, which is commonly referred to as stormwater. It occurs very shortly after a rainfall event, if not within an hour to 2 hours. It's often shallow in nature and it recedes very quickly. It's also quite hard to model because you can't calibrate or validate an overland flow path. There are no gauges in someone's backyard. There's no stream gauge down at the end of your street. And this is the kind of flooding that most of us are subject to nearly every couple of weeks in this part of the world. This was not my backyard this morning, but it was pretty similar to that. The next one is creek waterway flooding. Now this is actually associated with a defined water course and can occur quite quickly but with high velocity. And when I say quickly, within 2 to 6 hours, sometimes 12, that time of duration is relevant to the size of the catchment contributing to the creek. So a creek such as Norman Creek in South Brisbane, which is at the foothills of Mount Gravatt, is quite urbanised in its lower reaches, has a very quick response time. I lived opposite there for about 4 years. I would say within about 90 minutes of a very severe rainfall event, you had out-of-bank flooding. And it was like clockwork. You could count it every single time. And the other one is riverine flooding. And this is what we were partially affected, we were affected in 2011, in 1974 to some degree, in 2022, which I'll touch on as well. It's got a long lead time. So the Brisbane River is up to 30 hours or so lead time. So you know that a flood is coming. And that's why education and acknowledgement and understanding what your flood risk is important. It's slow moving, it's a deep inundation, and it often takes days to recede. I was recently out in Burke in Western New South Wales 2 weeks ago. The Darling River is in flood out there. It's been in flood for 2 months. That's how long that river has stayed at that level. And the rainfall that caused that flood happened 6 weeks ago. And that's quite awe-inspiring. You're sitting on the banks of the Darling River looking at rain that fell 1,200 kilometres away. And that's the type of lead time you get with large riverine systems. And again, there's a lovely photo of the ABC studios. Probably not the best place to put them, but at least they've got many levels, not on the ground level. So I want to touch on how council uses this flood information. Brisbane City Council, and I do want to say I don't work for Brisbane City Council, I've worked with them, I use their information on a daily basis. But they are probably the most proactive council in Australia when it comes to flood awareness and education. There is so much information at your fingertips, and there's a reason for it, and that's because we've suffered probably 2 very significant floods in at least 15 years or so. So the flood awareness mapping is this portal here. Literally, if you type into Google, that's what you come up with. It was developed after the 2011 flood, and it's been enhanced recently, very recently, as a couple of weeks ago. There's a lot of information there. There's also a lot of data that you can actually trawl through, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. So the mapping on the flood awareness map highlights those sources that I just previously talked about. So we've got overland flow path mapping. So this catchment here this is Downey Park in North Brisbane. That's the Breakfast Creek or Yeronga Creek down the bottom there. The hatched area is an overland flow path that's mapped by Brisbane City Council. And the way they've actually mapped that is by making a flood model. They've made a direct rainfall model that simulates a very localised and very intense rainfall event on that specific catchment. What that does show is that there's a fair bit of problem, but much of it is contained to the streets or to the open space areas. But there are some other areas and houses that are underwater, and we're looking at a part of Brisbane that was developed 100 years ago. The next map we've got is a creek waterway / riverine event, and as you can see, it's significantly different. The dark blue is very deep. That's probably the best way to actually summarise it. They call it a high likelihood of flooding, so we've got a 5% annual chance. So that is, to go back to the 1 in a year, that's around a 1 in 20 year event. And again, I don't want to be talking about that 1 in X years. I think it's antiquated, and it gives people a misunderstanding of how frequent flood events can occur. They also map the historical flood events on this portal, which is great. So this is green, and I apologise to anyone who's colourblind like me, because I can't see the green, but apparently my wife told me there's green on there. That's the 2011 flood extent in this part of the world. It's not particularly severe. There's some significant inundation in the lower reaches. There's some property damage. But it's worth knowing, as Margaret said, no 2 floods are the same. The 2011 flood was what we commonly refer to in the industry as a sunny day flood here in Brisbane. It didn't rain. Particularly didn't rain prior to the peak of the flood. It rained on the Monday, on the Tuesday afternoon, the Tuesday morning. But when the flood arrived on Wednesday, it was a sunny day, it was 32 degrees. And so that's what we call a sunny day flood. Of course, it's a different situation in the Lockyer Valley. That there, again, this is pink. It doesn't help that I'm red-green colourblind, but my wife did tell me that it's pink. That's the 2022 flood extent in this part of the world. There's a significant difference between the two events. If we go back, there's 2011, there's 2022. I've been reliably informed that this flood extent was actually created by stretching data sources across and using gauge level, survey marks, and also using their flood models to get to the tool. What we can see there is actually extensive inundation, and this is reflective of the rainfall event that occurred in this part of Brisbane. I can put my hand on my heart. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've never seen rainfall like it, especially in this part of the world. Upwards of 600 to 800 mil of rain fell on this part of Brisbane over a 3-day period. Further south you go, in 2022, Upper Crabs Creek in northern New South Wales had 1.3 metres of rain in 3 days. And 3 kilometres towards the coast, they had 300 millimetres. That's a stark difference between the two events. And that there is the 1974 flood. So people talk about this nasty flood event that happened in 1974 that caused so much damage. It wasn't as bad as that. It's a different flood event. And then we get to the other part of the BCC flood portal, and that's your floodwise property report. Previously, this information essentially told you what the different design event levels were, and then told you what the 74 and the 2011 event was. That's the new floodwise property report. There's a lot of information there. It also talks about what percentage of your property you can expect to be inundated. I believe there's a bit of rubberiness with those figures. They have done this for every property in Brisbane, by the way. And you can also see the height difference of this property, which is in East Brisbane, which is affected by February 22, slightly higher than 2011. I believe that's actually on the Norman Creek catchment. So moving forward in terms of the flood modelling space, we're just a tool, we're just a cog in the wheel. But I think there's a need to push to develop stronger education, adaptation and resilience in this space. We've got more information at our fingertips than we've ever had before. And that people that don't necessarily know how to run a flood model can actually, tangibly grab the data and look at it and look at what their risk is at their property. I should note, I think we'll be talking about it later on, there's a book that was developed a couple of years ago as part of the Water Futures group. It's by James Davis and Associates, which talks about resilience and planning in the Brisbane River catchment. I think we'll be talking about it further in the Q&A. We need to continue to refine flood modelling. Technology is getting more and more advanced. When I started doing this work, I was essentially looking at mathematical equation and really nasty looking one-dimensional models. Now I've got 2-dimensional models and 3D models at my fingertips. Unfortunately, the models get bigger, they get slower, so we want more detail to them. We need to investigate mitigation measures local and regional, and again, we'll touch on that later on. This is a space that's ongoing. It's working behind the scenes, but there are a lot of roadblocks and there are a lot of stakeholders. And as Margaret said, we need to probably look at some planning scheme amendments. We need to build a more resilient community by addressing some issues that are currently in our planning scheme. And just to highlight something that Margaret was talking about, if you know does anyone know where that is, that picture is? That's the Barrister Creek Hotel. And that you can actually, my kids get blown away because I talk about floods to them and their eyes roll on the back of their heads, but when I take them to the Barrister Creek Hotel for a steak, I get to tell them that's what Dad does, and that's how bad it can be. So yeah, look, I'd like to thank you for listening, and we'll have a chat later on. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. I'd like everyone to welcome our next speaker, Jane O'Sullivan. Jane works in research on population change policies that influence it, its connections with economic progress, resource scarcity, climate change, food and water security and biodiversity. She also convenes a Habitat Brisbane Bushcare site in Bracewell. She's an honorary senior research fellow in the School of Agriculture and Food Sciences, University of Queensland. You're welcome.
Okay, Okay, I'm just going to walk around and use the pointer on my slide. So I'm here only in my capacity as a flood-prone resident, and to give you a little bit of a picture of the experience of having your place flooded. This picture was taken at just after the peak of the 2011 flood, and we're going to have to put that. That's my house in the middle, and you can see it's kind of a low point in the street. There's higher houses either side. So yeah, we got pretty well and truly flooded in that event. And that's where it is on the Brisbane City Council flood map. And those white bits with the orange blotchy bits in are the overland flow areas that Andrew was talking about, which are not only very low, but prone to stormwater backup. And we're sitting right on one of those. So this is the house, and the road's actually built up across that watercourse. So the road forms a dam across the watercourse, and there's a little stormwater drain inside our yard here. But the first thing that happens when there's a really heavy event like that is that water starts coming out of that drain rather than into it. So yeah, our garage down there is about 1.5 meters below the spillway of the road. So by the time it's crossing the road, we're already well and truly flooded under the house. Now we did raise this house in 2003 when we did a big renovation before we moved in. We raised the meter, and we decided not to take it up to the Q100 flood level because we would have had to get a relaxation on the height. At that stage it was 8.5 metres, and they count that from the lowest point on your land, so up to the ridge cap there, we were going to go higher than 8.5 metres, so we didn't do that. And also because the neighbourhood at that time, you know, it would have looked a bit silly being that tall, and it's kind of weird to look back on it now because now everybody's out there, you know, with really high houses. So the 2011 flood came up to that level, 1.7 metres inside the house, and 2022, this February, came just about 10 centimetres above the floorboards, which is really annoying. But if we were to raise now, we would be compelled to go above the Q100 height, which is higher now than it was 20 years ago, and we'd have to basically go up to where our ceiling is now, with no livable space underneath. So these are a couple of houses across the road that have been built since 2011, and they're about 2.5 stories higher at the back, and only the top level is living area. If they were to build now, they'd have to go up another 0.5 metre higher. So, and I just wanted to say a couple of things about this little cottage down here, which is even lower than ours. Firstly, this year it got well and truly flooded, and it got completely stripped out, completely refitted, and sold for more than $800,000. So it, somehow or other, being flood prone isn't affecting the market value at all, which is kind of weird to me. The other thing is that they keep lining it with plasterboard. So one of the things that we did when we renovated our house was we thought, well, A, we don't think flood insurance is good value, so we chose not to have flood insurance, and we're very grateful that we didn't, for all sorts of reasons, because you don't have to wait for anyone, you just go in and do what you have to do. And it's just not good value for money. But anyway, so our flood insurance was that we decided not to use plasterboard. So we used fibrocement sheeting throughout the house. So we didn't have to strip our walls out, which meant we didn't have to strip all the architraves and the, wardrobe fittings and everything that you have to take out when you take out plasterboard. But this little cottage was re-lined with plasterboard, prone to be gutted again at the next flood. The second thing I wanted to say about that little cottage is that in 2011 it was a rental, and I knew the little Korean lady who lived there because we used to walk our kids to school together. And there's not enough said about tenants in floods. Tenants got a really bad deal. And those people, a young couple with their little kids, migrants who didn't have big social networks, the landlady turned up and directed volunteers to get everything out of the house onto the footpath. Now, as far as I know, the landlady didn't have any right to be on the property. But I met that lady afterwards at school, and she was traumatised by the experience because she lost all of the things that connected her with home because they were chucked out unnecessarily by somebody coming in, taking over her life, saying, "This is my house, I want you out of here, just go get lost." And they ended up in a caravan park because there was no free rent. Anyways, I'm just saying, much more needs to be done to help tenants, to tell tenants when they're renting a place like this that it is flood prone, and to make sure that tenants are protected in the event. So this is early on the morning of 27th of February this year, and you can see how this bit of the road is the low point. So at this point, we're already 1.5 meters under our house. And another thing I wanted to raise with this slide is that this is about the level it was when we evacuated before the 2011 flood. And I was standing on that footpath there waiting for my husband to wade in and turn the power off at the power meter that was about to go underwater. And there was a young man standing on the other side of this body of water looking amused, and so I spoke to him and he said, "Where is all this water coming from?" And I said, "It's the river, it's in flood." And he said, "But where did it come from?" And it's completely flabbergasted. And so I established that he was living in a share house up the road, and being young people, they're not listening to ABC radio, they're not, they're just completely disconnected from all of this news. Nobody had been up and down the streets door knocking to make sure that people knew it was happening or that they actually had capacity to get out. So how do we contact everybody? How do we do that? What's the best way to do it? Shouldn't we be going along door knocking and making sure everybody knows? This road's got another low point at the other end before there are any side streets. So at this point, he had about an hour to get vehicles out before they were trapped in there. And hopefully he took my advice, I don't know. So this is our house after the 2011 flood. You can see where it came to on the walls. And so you go back inside and it's really amazing how things float around and relocate themselves, and it's really quite intriguing to go through the house and see what all your things have been up to while you've been away. Tip for young players, leave the fridge door open because they float and they pull the cabinets off when they float and they get jammed in places you can't get out of. So unplug it, leave the fridge door open. This is our bedroom, and it's just, the enormity of the mess and trying to work out what to do first is kind of a big thing. You can see the paint slumped on the walls, so wherever there was plaster under the paint, it kind of lifted off and slumped. But because we've got fibro cement walls, all we had to do was go around and scrape all of those painted corners and seams, and we had a plasterer in for one weekend, did the whole house for $1,500 or something, and then we had a big working day with our friends to come and paint inside the house. We were one of the first people back in the neighbourhood. We were back in there within 6 weeks of the 2011 flood. We went to get new carpets, and the carpet people said, "Oh, you're the first flood victims we've had in so far." And lots of our friends were still out of their houses 9 months later waiting for the insurance company to do something. So then there's the big clean-up and the issue of, that's when you really have to be thinking about your mental health and pacing yourself and giving people the space and the consideration to be stressed out. My somewhat stressed out husband who's rather begrudging that I'm taking time out to take photos. And this weird monochrome effect of the vegetation that's been under. But we had amazing help from volunteers, and the parents of some friends of ours came around with their adult sons, spent the whole 3 days dawn till dusk there, and she just set up on the back deck and ran a camp kitchen and fed anybody who turned up. So it was absolutely amazing, but exhausting to supervise. You've got 15 people in your house wanting to do stuff, and you've got to kind of make sure that they're not turfing out stuff you want to clean up, and it's just very tiring. So, and then there's the whole trauma of your life on the lawn, and then this was what we woke up to on the 27th of February this year. So we haven't been given any forewarning of this. In fact, all the announcements were, don't worry, this isn't a 2011 event. So we were prepared for stormwater backup. We had everything downstairs up on benches, but we were woken up at 5:30 in the morning by a neighbour who was jogging, and we'd taken the car out of the garage and put it up on the road, and he broke us up to tell us to move the car because it was already coming up over the road. No warning of that. It was quite amusing because, we were flat out from 5:30 that morning, retrieving stuff from under the house and then packing up the stuff in the house, not knowing how far it was going to come up into the house. And about 7 o'clock that evening was the first time there was an announcement that this could be a major flood event. We've been at it all day by then. So my little tree nursery, that's on about the highest part of our block, and it's about 2 metres tall, so you'll see it when the flood gets up to the peak. So we spent all that day packing up. I was determined not to leave this time because we lost so much stuff last time that was savable. And this time it was still raining, so we had no idea how much further the water was going to come up because it was still raining. So I wasn't going to leave until the flood had peaked, or else it was too high for us to actually be useful. And we do have a canoe, so we did have an escape plan. But foolishly, we left the paddles under the house.
We got the question, where can people go to find out if they are flood affected, and what sources should they use to get emergency evacuation advice?
Thanks very much. I think, as I said in my presentation, there's a heap of information on the Brisbane City Council website. Look, as someone who's very active on social media, I spent the 22 event basically punching the screen at home, looking at all the different things people were saying on Facebook, and talking to people that said they were flood aware, they knew what was going on, and it was plainly false. And a falsehood travels pretty quickly on social media. So I'm a big advocate for looking at the Bureau of Meteorology, or BOM, whatever you want to call it, or Brisbane City Council, or your local council area. So the flood awareness map will provide you with extensive risk assessment of your property. Myself personally, I live 100 metres from an arm of Bulimba Creek. I am pretty comfortable with my flood risk, mainly because I also grabbed the flood model from council and tweaked it and made sure it was right. But I'm happy with that risk, but if I was closer, it's more understanding what type of flood you're at risk from. For me, right now, my risk of flood is if it rains and my patio fills up with water. And that's not going to cause 1.7 metres of water through my property, but I know that if I don't do something about it in the next couple of months or get a drainage expert out, that I may have a couple of centimetres throughout part of my house, which is still pretty annoying. So look at your main channels, your local council, ABC Radio, again, is a great source, and also the Bureau. Thanks.
I'll just add to that. I agree with the misinformation that can be on some community photo pages, but photographs are really hard to Photoshop quickly. So for me, I also spend a lot of time on social media during the 2022 floods, and the photographs are really good because all my neighbours would post photos of the places that I knew were vulnerable. So it taps into your local knowledge. So some of those really, really localised community groups are really good, like the Friends of whatever. So they're actually quite good. Yeah, the official knowledge is really great, but local knowledge is really important. Yeah.
Okay. I like Gerard.
Wrongly accused.
Just a moment.
Question.
Second question.
So to anyone in the panel, question 2, how can people identify which of the 2 following categories they fall into? A, live in a circumstance that they're able to better cope with future flood events by improving their flood resilience and having an organised flood evacuation plan. And B, live in a circumstance which is no longer tenable for future flood events and may have to consider relocating.
Well, how would you know? Well, you would know because of I'm obviously a fan of past knowledge, so you know from being living in the area, and you obviously know because you've survived a few floods so far. So that's the thing. But the issue that Jane's pointed out that is really, really important is the social variables in communities. And if you're a renter, it is a totally different story. If you're an English-speaking that is your first language, that's really useful. The flood maps and all the rest of it on the BOM side or the council sites are really, really good, but you need to have a lot of literacy, both English literacy and map literacy, and that's a really big problem. And so a lot of the strategies that we've put in place work really well for certain groups within the community, but for other groups it doesn't work at all. And so I think that sort of decision is whether you're in a high risk or a low risk category. It's a very personal decision because it depends on your personal circumstances, whether you're physically able, whether you're mentally well, whether you're physically capable of evacuating your house. An 18-year-old is not going to be able to move a piano. So that's a very personal decision and one that can't be made in times of crisis. So that's what I'm advocating now, is that's the sort of thing we need to do now when we're given a fair warning, because as you said, some of these floods are really, really fast. Ipswich, for example, even the river raises can flood in 6 hours. So that's a very personal thing that you'll need to use a lot of information and a lot of prior thinking to work that out for yourself.
Do I need to answer that? I don't think that's... No, that's right. Yeah, I think the warning, Andrew said, the river floods take 36 hours to get there, but that's not really the warning we got. You know, the warning was, I think, lunchtime on the 11th of January 2011, and we were up to the floorboards by, I don't know, 6 p.m. So, and that's not a lot of time to work out what, especially the first time around, work out what it's worth packing up and how many carloads of stuff you can ferry to your friend's place. And, you know, there's just so many variables that you try and juggle. So yes, it helps to have a plan, but it's really hard to think that through if you haven't actually been through a flood before.
I got flooded in 2022. I live on a hill. I don't live near a creek or a river because I don't. But I got flooded from overland flow, and by the time I got the warning, my living room had water flowing down its chimney and had for a few hours. I've never had water in that chimney ever. So, you know, I got 585 millimetres in 2 days. That's freak. And there's really not a lot you can do with that. What we're talking about, what I'm largely talking about, is the ones that you can get a lot more warning.
That's right. Yeah, I think Margaret makes a very good point about everyone's different, your situation's different. There are a lot of avenues out there now to look at building back better, building flood resilient homes, and also investigating options of buyback schemes, which are kicking off in Ipswich right now. So that's something to keep in mind. Thank you.
That probably leads into question 3. how can affected residents or businesses register to apply for the $741 million state and federal government's funding package to assist with the two scenarios above? That is, funding to improve a property's flood resilience or buyback scheme. You're going to run out of money really quickly.
Do you know the answer to that one?
No, I don't. Does anyone else in the room know how?
Anyone know?
You do?
Hi.
The example of that is Grantham.
Yeah.
You've got to have a look at Grantham. There's a book that's been written with about 150 pages of what actually happened. And the Lord Mayor of the Grantham area went on a whole scheme of buybacks and everything. The details are in the book.
Yeah.
And after about 4 years of bashing his head against the brick wall, he died.
So the book's fantastic. If you haven't read it, Jamie Simmons wrote the book. He's now touring America, telling Americans how to move places, which is great. It's great for
It's a great film.
But the answer to the one about the buyback scheme at the moment is that there is an application process. It's being run, as far as I know, by the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, and it's being done and managed at a local level by local city council. So as I said, I'm in Ipswich. Ipswich City Council already had its list ready. So it was first cab off the ranks. It had 50 houses that are already underway. It's got another 150 in the system. So it's the Queensland Reconstruction Authority that are running that, as far as I know. Is that the nods I'm getting from the people who really know, which is the
there's the
Minister of
website
Home?
on PQL.
Can we use the microphone, please?
Sorry.
We've got a couple of people up here.
Apologies.
Yeah, there is a website on Queensland government's website, Resilient Homes. So that's qld.gov.au/resilient homes, where you can go and have a look at all those. There's quite a lot there as well. And the other thing is, there's a bit up there around design guidelines for flood resilient homes, and that's all about retrofitting your house depending on what you've got to try and minimise that impact. So
Yeah, on the Brisbane City Council portal that I showed earlier, it's a new button that was put up where you can click on it and it will take you to a number of links about exactly that. So there's a big push on giving the information out to people in the community.
And the Resilient Homes program is fantastic. So James Davison, who you mentioned before, is one of the architects behind that, but there's a number of people. So it's his he kicked it off. Appropriate, kicked it off. And he
Terrible pun.
I know. There's a lot of very practical things in this scheme, and some of them we can do anyway. One of them is when you start looking around your house, you realise that our power points are at ground level. There's really no reason for that. So next time you're renovating your kitchen, I mean, I'm not saying, I know these things are expensive, but when you're renovating your kitchen, even if you move up your power point 1 metre, or you don't put in chipboard cabinetry, but you put in stainless steel, or you put in a hardwood, or you put in a polished floor or a rug rather than a carpet that can get rolled up and moved. Those sorts of things are really, really practical things that we can do when we're thinking about, even when we're renting, we can do that. We can, when we renovate, think about those sorts of things. So it's just a process of thinking some of that through each time we renew anything in our house. Buy a new piece of furniture, think about whether it's the best one to buy. Because the landfill problem is another huge one. All that stuff ends up in a landfill. And we saved a lot more stuff in 1974 than we did in 2011 and 2022 for exactly that reason.
We now have a 30-minute session inviting questions from the audience. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll come up and bring the microphone to you.
Oh, hi, thank you. It's been very, very informative. I live in probably one of the most flood-prone areas of Rockleigh. I live off Sherwood Road down towards the golf course. We are actually the highest physical point in Rockleigh, strange as it might seem, and our block doesn't flood. But everyone around us is suffering every time we get water. I'm very interested in the discussion that was raised about the benefits, or not so much, of insurance. After the last flood, I read every line of my policy, plus all the other documents. And right at the end of it, there was this little thing, this line that said, your flood insurance will be invalid if your flooding is due to tidal effects. So what they're saying is you can have all the flooding you like, but if you have a king tide at the same time, I'm sorry, but you're not covered. Now, we built our house after the 2011 flood, so it's 2.4 metres above the highest level of flooding in Rocklea. It's steel, if we ever flood, Brisbane is gone. So, but we've actually looked at the numbers on this buying flood insurance, and this year we're going to discontinue it. It is a total waste of time, because if you read the small print, a lot of it has these little exclusion things that come out that may or may not cover you. Everyone needs to do their due diligence, but I really think that the approach that you mentioned about take the insurance away. Ours is something like $6,000 plus and going north a year, and it just went up another $1,000. So it's, you know, decreasing returns on flood insurance. So I think everyone should really look at that seriously, depending on the area and the information you've heard today, but it's a really, really valid point, along with resilience and everything else that you do as well.
And I take that as a comment, really, and a comment on the construction of insurance policies is not appropriate.
Yeah, I just want to respond to that as a bit. You know, people think, oh, we need flood insurance like we have fire insurance. It's different. You know, if your house burns down, you lose everything and you have to reconstruct the house. If you're sensible about flood resilience, you don't lose that much when you get flooded. You don't lose enough to be paying an insurance company $6,000 a year or $18,000 a year, as our next door neighbour was recently quoted. You know, it'd be even more for me. But if there's a real flood risk, they're charging enough to rebuild your house within, you know, when we first looked at it, it was a Q100 flood risk or 1% flood risk. So the insurance company took the cost of rebuilding your house divided by 50, and that's your premium. So every 50 years you're paid to rebuild your house. And it just doesn't make sense because the flood loss is not the entire house. The flood loss is what you haven't made resilient to flood. And that can be really quite affordable. You know, we had to replace our carpets and the inverter for the solar panels and the pump for the rainwater tank and not much else after this year. So we got away with it for maybe $12,000. We could have spent that on flood insurance in 6 months.
Just to add, just to reiterate that point, from an anecdotal point of view, I met with a man earlier this year in Tumbulgum. If you know where Tumbulgum is in northern New South Wales, it's on the banks of the Tweed River, downstream from Wollongbar. It's one of the most flood-prone towns in Australia. He told me he was paying $900 a month flood insurance for this property. He cancelled it in November, just gone, and his property had 700 mil of water above the livable area, which is 3 metres off the ground in his property. And I said, oh, that's a horrible decision. He goes, no, I dodged a bullet, mate. I dodged a bullet. He said, I'm a chippy, I'm so stupid that all I realised is I have to spend $4,000 of my own time and money to clean the house up instead of me paying someone $900 extra a month. So again, it's a very personal thing as well, and it should be iterated that not all insurance policies are the same.
This question is addressed to Mr. Thompson. It's really about the bigger picture. I mean, it's inconceivable that the third largest city in Australia can flood like this every whatever number of years with huge social, financial and other hardships occurring. Is there any mitigation that can be put in place at all? I mean, I'm thinking of dams further up in the river, below the Yeronga. I just wonder what your thoughts are, because this clearly is a major problem.
Yeah, look, flood mitigation and flood proofing is a multifaceted approach. It's a multifaceted problem. Physical mitigation is only one small part of this gigantic machine. Your flood mitigation is only as good as the flood that it's going to contain. As Margaret said, 50% of the Brisbane River catchment is located downstream of Ivanhoe and Somerset. So you're looking at putting dams on the Bremer, on the Lockyer. These are currently being investigated by people with larger and squishier brains than me that work in the state government. I'd just like to inform that, so Lismore is, everyone knows where Lismore is, it's flooded twice, 3 times actually, twice this year, and is currently under a major flood watch right now. The town is surrounded by a levee. The levee is 2 to 3 metres high, it's concrete, it looks like the Berlin Wall, it's covered in graffiti. It's not the nicest looking thing. It only protects that city, that town, in a 10% AEP, a 1 in 10 year flood event. What that levee has done though, has given the residents, not now, but before the 2017 tropical cyclone Debbie flood, was a bit of a false sense of security. I can't remember the numbers, but there was an astonishing percentage of people in that town that thought they'd never flood again because there's a big brick wall there. And it turns out it actually overtops quite frequently. There's a lot of measures that can be undertaken. The Brisbane River, the problem is the Brisbane City Council is only one small part of the Brisbane River catchment. So you've got Somerset Regional Council, Lockyer Valley Council, you've got Scenic Rim, even the Logan that comes in, it's all one big giant floodplain. And and Ipswich City Council as well. And each one of these councils is sort of moving forward and looking at areas. They do integrated catchment management plans, looking at mitigation measures. I know one such mitigation measure is revegetating the Bremer River. And if you've ever been to the Bremer River, you can almost walk across it. It's almost dirt. It's a horrible looking river, and that's because of all the land clearing upstream. And so what they were looking at doing is what happens if we revegetate the entire catchment. And what that actually does is it costs over $1 billion, but it drops flood levels by 150 millimetres. That's all that investment does. So I think it's multifaceted. I think there's a lot more conversation that needs to happen about it. But again, it's only as good as the flood you're trying to contain.
Might move to the next question.
Is it moving? Oh, hi. My place hasn't been flooded, but it's come from the bottom of the drive. And now the topography has changed across the road, I'm wondering about if it's viable to put some sandbags around the bottom unit and how much would we need to do. I live just at the tennis near where they're doing Yeronga Petty Green, so that was 2 paddocks of water in 2011, and now it's all built up really, really high.
So sorry, what's the...
Well, I'm just wondering if it's worthwhile. If it's worthwhile putting sandbags around one of our bottom units to try and, because I think we're going to flood, but I don't know how far it will come.
And look, that's probably something that we need to address, is that we need to be aware of what's happening right now. I mean, I don't think a permanent solution is putting sandbags around a unit.
No, I predicted the last 2 floods.
Yep.
So I reckon we're going to do it again this year.
Sure.
I just want to be prepared.
I think yeah.
Only 20 minutes left, there's a number of people there.
Talk about that.
I'll go. Addressing the big white elephant in the room, which is we can't continue to drop vegetation, put concrete down, expect the same amount of runoff. I don't care who you are, what PhD you got, it just does not happen. In your opinion, as a panel, do you think there is a line in the sand where we need to say, stop, no more development, period, because there is not enough detention, there isn't enough science, mathematics, whatever you want to call it, to take out the vegetation, put concrete in and say, everything's fine, look, we've only got 0 influx. It doesn't happen as a panel. What's your thoughts?
My answer is yes. We now know there are areas that people should not be living in, and the gentleman in the corner in Rockley knows full well that that's one of those. When they had the Christchurch earthquakes, they had the courage to have no build back areas. They just declared the red zone and said we're not going back there, and they haven't. And they've done it in other parts of the world where they've had other natural disasters. We have not had the courage to do that. And I think we are looking at a city that might be growing extremely exponentially, is the word of the year, isn't it? And we're just using the same time worn-out solutions every single time. History is repeating itself and not improving it. And I'm the biggest advocate for, yes, we have legacy issues, we've created problems in the past, but what I'm most concerned about is we're continuing to make the same mistakes. So,
So I say there, I think there is a tipping point, and just building more dams and just building more people isn't the solution. And I think we are at that tipping point, and I thought we were there at the 2011 floods.
Just comment from James said earlier, it's like a lack of political will. I live in the Corinda area, and I'm the same, all of those houses have got flooded and flooded and flooded. They've cleaned them out and they sold them for exactly the same price. So the political will isn't there for the people that are affected are, that's correct. But until the political is there to mandate that you are unable to build in those areas, even stroke or at a local government level with the planning approvals that are given to known floodplains, until there's political ownership with respect to it at all levels of government, they're going to keep putting down concrete and building where they should.
Why do you think no one can council turned up? Why do you think no one can council turned up?
There's a gentleman down there first.
Hi. Yeah, I'm from the Logan River area, and the council has basically said it's where the Logan and the Albert connect are all the floodplains. They've approved one development of an over 50s resort of 400 people that's there and has taken the capacity away. They've approved another that's 80, that's probably going to go to somewhere around 200. And then they're going to build a freeway through the floodplain. They were told 30 years ago not to do it. It's too expensive and it's a problem. They're still going ahead with it. And so the other question kind of answered that, but we're going to have 5.8 million in southeast Queensland by 2041, which is what Stephen Miles wants, it seems. What's the solution?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a bit of a step back and acknowledge that there is a problem. I think the specific issue there is that we've got council, and you've also got state government and Department of Transport and Main Roads. There's long-term infrastructure projects, but I really do think that there needs to be a step back and look at the planning scheme and look at certain issues that are in the planning scheme. I know for certain that Gold Coast City Council has quarantined development in a significantly large part of their council area that's subject to regular flooding. And that quarantine isn't saying you can't build here, but they've basically worded it that you can't build there. Essentially, the structure that you can build cannot be built there. It's just a way of dodging it. And that's, I think, council's turning that into a massive big green community space.
Next question.
Comment only. In Water Futures by James Davison, he exposes the work of Jackie Crow. She suggests looking at the sediments that the 1730 were higher than 1841. What would happen if we had a big flood and a big cyclone coincide? A bit like in Japan when the nuclear reactor survived the earthquake and got swamped by the tsunami. Should we consider those dual events? Insurance is very, very important. I helped clean out a house. I was shocked at the stuff that was thrown away that could be fixed. When I asked why, they said, oh, insurance will cover it. I think we should rethink insurance.
Thank you. I'll come to some of these people. There's one gentleman down here.
Thank you.
Just to acknowledge that, the scale of the flood absolutely affects what resilience measures we've taken, whether they're effective. If we have one like this 17 whatever flood that's metres and metres above our suburbs, the scale of the disaster is going to be of a completely different nature, because you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people rendered homeless for a long time.
Technical question for Andrew. You talked about the rainfall, you talked about the topography of the land, but you didn't talk about the profile of the Brisbane River, and it's an organic sort of thing, the profile, I guess there's sediments coming down, and also Moreton Bay, there's silting in Moreton Bay. So I was wondering if you just comment on the effect that has on sort of flooding, because I would think it would have a big effect if there's change to the ground level or the bottom of the, above where the water sort of stops and the ground starts.
No, I understand exactly what you're saying. It's a tricky question because it does have a very real impact on flooding. As I mentioned before, when we're flood modelling, we do design event flood models and you do historical flood models. Generally with design event flood models, they are conservative in nature. So we will actually model the Brisbane River as almost an impervious surface. so that the water level that will get surveyed and bathymetry, but we'll apply a water level that is effectively completely blocking it. So you're overestimating how much can be carried down there. So it is already sort of stepping over that boundary, but it's a very valid question. And again, that's one of the cogs of a greater catchment analysis, is looking at sediment transport down from the higher catchment areas. There's a horrible problem out in Moreton Bay right now that is, I think they do a report card every year and it's never been above a C, as far as I know. I may be proven wrong. It's pretty bad out there in Moreton Bay. It's shocking in the Brisbane River. It's particularly shocking after a flood event. Sedimentation is a very real problem. There are a lot of moves to actually address that by looking at in-stream erosion protection measures in all the feeder tributaries in the Lockyer Valley. But until we address the fact that probably a large amount of that catchment has been put aside for farming and agricultural purposes, it's probably not going to happen.
I'd just like to talk about the over-reliance of engineering solutions a lot of the time. And to be honest, God and engineer are not interchangeable terms, despite what they think. So it is very true when you look at planning solutions that are put forward for when they want to do a development in inappropriate areas. The answer that we are often given is that there is an engineering solution. And I think we have to move away from that. And if you were in any doubt about that, talk to the people who live around Flemington Racecourse at the moment. And there was an engineering solution that actually went absolutely against the best interests of the community at large. The one comment, and I would point back to you about this, is I think when we make planning decisions in areas, we have to start including the community, and we have to start talking to them about their local knowledge and the way that flood has worked in the past. And one thing I would say to you is be very wary about what you believe about the Brisbane City Council flood modelling. They actually went shopping for the person who would give them the best result for their flood modelling. And I can show you actual proof of that because they went to 3 different companies and they got the flood modelling that they wanted out of it. And that is very dangerous. And I also know from personal experience where they actually changed the levels for flood modelling. Where, for example, at the Milton Tennis Court site, they had the level there that was measured by the actual people in the thing was 11 metres. The reported level for the Brisbane City Council was 8. So that's a huge difference. Also, a lot of our engineering solutions, as we've already pointed out, give us impermeable surfaces, and the thing about that is when water flows along impermeable surfaces, it does a hell of a lot more damage because it goes faster.
Look, we might take that as a comment and move on.
If I could just add one thing, I literally have written a book about it.
It's on the screen, or was.
Yes, engineering, since the 1970s, they've understood that engineering is one of a whole suite of things. Public education, warnings, and working with the local community is very much a part of that. And that's where we need to move to. So I support what you're saying in terms of it's one solution in a suite of options.
Next question, the attendant goes.
Yeah, hi. Hi. I noticed, Andrew, you said that the Brisbane City Council website has a lot of information on flooding. It does, but for planning purposes. This weekend, I've got numerous alerts saying heavy rainfall. None of those has told me whether I'm actually in danger. There's no information provided to alert people, do they need to sandbag their houses? They publicise the fact that sandbags are available, but what the hell, what are they doing to try and fit it all together? So I dispute the fact that Brisbane City Council has useful information on their website, because none of it helps when it comes to flooding.
Your point is well made. What's missing, and this refers back to the comment behind you, is that what's actually missing is we have now a lot of data and we have a lot of information, and it's readily available. What's not working, and this is why I do talks on a Sunday afternoon, is because it's not translated. And that, yes, unless you have that level of literacy, and what I don't want to know what the flood modelling down the road is. What I actually want to know is, do I put out my sandbag now? Am I going to flood? And that's not what's in the system. Now, I don't know if we go down Jane's suggestion of knocking door to door, because they did do that in 2011 and people ignored it. People got letters and ignored it. I don't know what the translation from data to actual boots on the ground making a change is, but that is what's missing in this scenario.
Just to add to that, it is most definitely missing, and what we're finding is that more and more people are moving away from mainstream media. So 20 years ago, Channel 7, Channel 9, Channel 10, wall-to-wall coverage of the 2011 flood event. I think I turned it on this year and there was, it wasn't Hogan the Hero, but it was something like that. It was on TV. I found it really frustrating, and I'm someone who works in the industry, who knows where all the information is, and I found it frustrating that information wasn't out there. I do know that there is movement in this space that probably isn't directed from council, but is directed from other sort of industry groups that's looking to promote that. I don't know what the magic bullet is. Is it a combined social media approach? I don't know if anyone else got 10 text messages from BOM yesterday in a row. I got them all within about a 10-minute period that essentially I was going to die. But I looked at that text message and I'm someone who knows what's going on. And I was, no, it's not. And I looked at the map. But if those messages go out to people that don't know what's going on, it can cause the wrong situation. So, fully agree exactly what you say there. In terms of technical information, Brisbane City Council's got it all there. The communication, it's not happening. You have to dig a bit.
And was that the hero or the bomb?
That was,
And with the bias of an historian, that is the role of social sciences. With social sciences and humanities have been left out of this conversation too much. It's always been about the technical, the engineering, the science, and that's not getting through the communities. What communities want is stories and information that are practical.
They're not a flood engineer, and I realise that. We've gone as far as we can.
Yeah, we've got the information, but we're not getting it out there.
Expert.
I don't have a question, but Andrew had to go down to Brecon Creek to see a level of flood. I don't understand why. Is it too much to ask that we be able to... So I don't
Oh, sorry. I just, it's a comment more than a question. You had to go down to Brecon Creek to find out flood levels. Is it too much to ask us to be able to just walk out somewhere close to home and see where our flood level is? Because I just think that's not enough. There's not enough there. I know there's some sensitivities about it, but
from my point of view, if I live in a flood-prone suburb, I want to be able to walk out my front door and look at a light pole, and I want to see gauge data on it. I don't work for a council. I think the biggest issue in doing that is that there is a fear that it will drive people away from certain areas, that maybe the information isn't out there to say, look, there is a risk here. It's okay to live in this suburb, but you need to know what your risk is. So there's a bigger picture there. I 100% agree with you.
The bigger picture is real estate agents. They used to have a lot more sign markers in Lismore, but they were taken away because of the real estate market because people couldn't sell their houses. So that's also in the communication package that you need to tell people that it will come to this height, but what do you do about it? So without that conduit of information, yes, that's a scary sign. So that's why they took them down. I got gagged in council once because I was putting out flood markers. It's all right, I'm quite proud of that.
So I just wanted to talk about how we manage our volunteers. I'm up here. How we manage our volunteers either during or after the floods. So maybe having a register of maybe people's skills who might be able to help. I know that during the 2011 floods I was a midwife. I was actually a home birth midwife and I had a lady give birth in my home. We couldn't actually get to any hospital locally, so she ended up giving birth in my home. And I know that it would have been good if people could put down what their skills are when they went to go and help out in other people's homes who were flood affected, who weren't particularly living in flood affected homes and went to go and help out in inundated properties, after the flood levels receded. That they might have been able to use their skills, maybe as chippies or electricians or that sort of thing, just to kind of organise the volunteers a little bit better. But I think we need to get better at that.
Yeah, I agree. To me, that comes back to that 97% preparation or 97% reaction. We had a really good mud army, but I want a flood army. I want one that comes in beforehand so that we have our list of places to take your stuff, people you can call on, and then we have to use them properly, because in the mud army in 2011 there were a lot of people sitting on buses for a long time and there were a lot of people all going to the same place. So we need to have those processes in place as well, and we need to give them real jobs to do when they get there that are very effective, because a disenchanted volunteer is a bad volunteer because they don't come back on day 2. So that again is that proactive stuff where we need, and congratulations on giving birth and being in a flood, hats off to you. But people like you are invaluable. That we have so many community resources that we don't use.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for putting the forum on. I've really enjoyed the presentation so far. We've got a politician in the room today. And I'm just wondering if we can step back a bit, because you spoke before about the issue with multi-catchments, getting all these councils lined up. We've got the systemic pressure of development, with the Olympics coming up, so there's, a lot of the concrete's coming to go down no matter what we do, unless a big decision is made. Like in some places in the world where the state government has come in and just said, we're going to take charge here because there's a whole bunch of issues that can only be solved by one player. But the important part is, how do we bring community into this? And we've seen the latest election, community is no longer, lying down. They're going to take matters into their own hand. I'm assuming that's why this group has been set up. My question is sort of, and I don't want to take away from the immediate issue of housing and planning and suburban development and these sort of things here, but I work in the food space, and I've spoken to the CEO of Brisbane Markets, I've spoken to the head of town planning for Brisbane City Council, and no one is thinking about how Brisbane is going to feed itself into the future. And we're seeing multiple issues at many, many levels, whether it's geopolitical, logistical, or even now where we're seeing most of the northern rivers with the land subsidence and even small country roads being taken out, and they're never going to be replaced because they're so expensive to replace. So, Jane, maybe you've got a thought on how we feed Brisbane into the future.
How do we feed any large city in the future if there's a crisis? The whole of humanity is sacrificing resilience for the sake of growth. We're just pushing all our systems to be more finely tuned so that we can pack a few more people in and get a bit more economic activity happening more rapidly. And it's undermining all of our support systems. It's just making the whole system so brittle. The thing about the growth of big cities like Brisbane is that they're always sited around the most fertile land that we have. And, in southeast Queensland, those red krasnozems around Redland Bay and Sunshine Coast are precious jewels on this dry, eroded continent. And we're just covering them with concrete because it makes more money for somebody this year than keeping on producing food on them for the next several hundred years. We're just not far-sighted enough and not, it's not the sort of thing free markets do well. You need proper leadership that's actually thinking about the interests of the next generation, and we don't have it.
Thank you.
We've got about 10 minutes left.
My name is Jamie and I live in Graceville, and I've been working in disaster recovery and resilience for over a decade. And I just want to acknowledge the Southern Brisbane Suburban Forum for bringing these wonderful speakers together, and also for all of you for coming. One thing that I have also noticed is that different policies and legislations across our country, both local, state and federal, we've got the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, the Australian Disaster Preparedness Framework, the Australian Emergency Management Arrangements, and within these documents there's this idea of a shared responsibility of resilience and what that means without clearly defining the meaning or the process for implementation. And they fail to specifically recognise who is actually responsible for building resilience. So as a result, this shared responsibility actually ends up being distributing obligations. And if you think about, if we have no idea who's doing what, it's always going to fall to community. And it's been acknowledged by the new Coordinator General of the National Emergency Management Agency that we shortchange communities if at every stage we don't deal with the disaster risk and build community resilience. This is about enabling our first responders, and I take your point that you were speaking about earlier. Why are communities not being consulted? And in fact, I'd like to take it a step further. We should be demanding not just consultation, but it being a part of the ongoing governance and monitoring and evaluation of the communities that we live in. We cannot keep going on this 3-year, 4-year political cycles and just be at the whim of potentially politicians, and that's why it's social capital. It's people coming together that determines good recovery outcomes. It's not how much money you throw at a situation. And so if we're doing, as Margaret says, putting the money at the beginning and doing that mitigation and disaster resilience, we've got stronger communities who don't need necessarily a flood army because they might have their neighbours and other community members actually assisting. But I'm really grateful that you brought this together. It's really, really exciting.
One little take as a comment.
Two of the three speakers we've heard today talked about social connection, and the third speaker actually demonstrated by the mother that cooked set up the kitchen on the table and fed the volunteers that were coming from the house. How do we sustain efforts to build those connections that will keep our most vulnerable safe?
So the question is, how do we keep connections to keep the vulnerable safe? Is that what you're saying?
How do we sustain the efforts?
Well, sustaining the efforts is really difficult because we lurch now. After these floods, unfortunately, we will lurch into drought and then we'll lurch into fire. And so research shows that as the water goes down, so does our capacity to make a difference on floods. So the conversation has to continue. And I was interested, I gave a similar talk in Ipswich recently that you were at, where remember we were told that the Northern Territory people talk about cyclones all the time, and they keep that discussion front of mind. We don't. We will talk about floods now, we will probably talk about floods till February, and then we won't talk about floods again. So there is a really big role there to keep those conversations going, and when we've got a climate of denial about problems that we deal with, that's very, very difficult. And it's at every level that we have that denial.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that at the start of the COVID-19 lockdowns, there was quite a lot of effort to build networks of volunteers and encourage people to put up their hand and ask for help around isolation. And, so those networks got built up and they're still there to be drawn on in other crises. So, I think there's capacity there to have, regardless of what the crisis is, to have those networks, even if they're not particularly active. At least they're a starting point for the next time there is a crisis that people can sign on and be organised volunteers instead of random volunteers.
You all agree that Dorothy and McCallum was correct? Thanks, everyone. We might, unless somebody has a compelling need to ask one last question. This gentleman here, the last one.
Thank you, sir. We're to from here. Thank you for putting this on. I made a comment to the organisation about a week or so ago that there is already a group in Karilba. The community is getting together to do their thing. There's a work starting in Yeronga to provide that sort of information for those who can't read the maps and all the rest of it. I believe there's something happening in Graceville. So I really would be annoyed if the wheel is being reinvented in all those 4, if not more, locations. My question is where to now? So it's probably a segue to the next bit.
Is that a question? That you like that? We like that answer.
Where are we going now?
Never wants to answer that one.
So I was going to make a few comments at the end. I'm president of the Southern Brisbane Suburban Forum, and I'll leave my comments to the end, but I just will say that we are a forum and we'll be continuing into next year and the year after and the year after and the year after. So we work with communities within the type closed suburban areas, as the groups that here, like South Brisbane, Graceville, Yeronga, all the places that you've mentioned and more on the south side. So we're happy to have conversations about how we might help in terms of a more coordinating role. Okay. It seems like we're concluding at the moment. So if you could bear with me for a few more minutes, I will make a few comments. More in terms, like Margaret, I'm a historian. I'm a philosophical intellectual historian. So my role in this sort of landscape is to help people in terms of the thinking process. We've had a few speakers that actually talked about miscommunication, the problems of trying to overcome old paradigms in thinking in terms of council and state government. And my role has been to try and to demonstrate to government and to council and to the community that, you know, often it starts with the capacity to think things through in critical ways. And philosophers, sociologists are very good at that. Okay, well, it's been an informative and valuable time this afternoon. The Southern Brisbane Suburban Forum Incorporated is a professional, resource and well-managed structure. The forum aims to consult widely and cooperate with a variety of governments, institutional and private stakeholders, whilst remaining independent as a true representative of the communities. In short, the forum seeks to avoid being captured by any organised lobby or party political interest. I'm sure you will agree that the forum has achieved that mission this afternoon. We will continue next year to deliver a major forum on an infrastructure and a suburban issue relevant for what 2023 will deliver. I should note that the year 2023 begins the 3-year commemorations for the city of Brisbane. The year 2023 will mark 200 years since the explorer John Oxley and the crew of HMS Mermaid surveyed Moreton Bay and the Brisbane River. The following year, 2024, will mark 200 years since Commandant Henry Miller's arrival in Moreton Bay with what became as the Moreton Bay Penal Colony. These two bicentennial events of 2023 and 2024 are also important because of the first contact between the colonists and the original peoples of the land and culture that extends back at least 10,000 years ago. The centenary of the formation of the Greater Brisbane City Council in 1925 and the centenary being 2025 from the amalgamations of shires under the Greater Brisbane Plans links and closes off well the 3-year period of significant anniversaries for Queensland. A colonial 19th century is connected to that of the modern 20th century. The creation of the Greater Brisbane came during the centenary remembrance of the city's earliest formation. The next few years is now. The next few years, I want you to listen carefully. The next few years is now an opportunity to create something great again. Alas, the council has not shown no interest in their commemoration events, and like Margaret, it is extremely frustrating as historians, and it's true for philosophers and sociologists, that councils and state governments do not listen to a whole knowledge base in terms of the work that we are doing. Because, if you forget history, you're doomed, as they say. It is often down to members of the community to get anything done, and today I must thank so many of them that I fear I might leave someone out.
My name is Ruby, and I want to introduce you to the Brisbane River floodplain. It's home to 280,000 people living in Lockyer Valley, Somerset, Ipswich and Brisbane. It's a beautiful part of the world and a great place to live, work and play. It's also home to the largest river in southeast Queensland, so being flood resilient is part and parcel of living here. It's about understanding our flood risk so we can better plan, respond and recover from floods. In 2011, we experienced a large flood that impacted us in different ways. Our community spirit shone through as we pulled together to recover. This spirit of collaboration lives on as we continue to look for ways to be a more flood-resilient community. We can't stop floods from happening, but we can increase our resilience. As you're about to see, flooding is a natural part of the Brisbane River catchment. Rainfall captured across the catchment flows into the valley that forms the Brisbane River, which was carved out of bedrock over millions of years as water drained from the catchment into Moreton Bay. History shows that no two floods are the same. They vary depending on factors such as the intensity of rainfall and tidal conditions. So, to better understand our flood risk, governments use state-of-the-art computer modelling to identify the range of flood events that can occur, ranging from smaller, more frequent floods to larger, less likely floods. They then use this information to look at the different ways we can build our resilience to floods. Phew! The result is the Brisbane River Strategic Floodplain Management Plan. This shares our collective understanding of current and future flood risk, including how population growth, climate change, and future development may affect flooding in years to come. It's a guide for how we can all work together to strengthen our flood resilience to help us bounce back after floods. Here are just a few examples. Disaster management will be supported with new information such as flood impacts to roads to help plan safe evacuation routes for the community. Land use planning will consider both current and future risk to ensure land uses are appropriate. Building controls will incorporate flood-resilient design and building materials to help people return to their homes and workplaces faster after a flood. Structural options such as levees and floodgates have been identified for further investigation that will help reduce flood risks. All these things and more are helping us reduce the impact of floods.